And welcome to Ramp Up to Retirement, the podcast focused on what you need to know to retire. In fact, we're your trusted source in that topic, as a matter of fact. And the man who we lean on for all things is your host, Dan Reese. Hey, Dan, how are you?
I'm doing great. Yep. It's spring is upon us, so life is good.
Yes. Yes, it is. And everything is green and the trees are green. And that's been great, except that the trees have exploded, Dan. And I feel like I've been eating bowls and bowls of tree pollen.
I think you're not alone. I actually saw something the other day. Supposedly pollen counts are up, and I don't know the reason for that. But yeah, a lot of people are really having issues. Waking up and you can't breathe. You're like, oh my goodness.
And I walk around, I just feel the powder in my throat. It's been amazing. I washed my car and I've been in the afternoon. It's yellow again. So, but I'll take the trade-off. I'll take the trade-off every time.
Absolutely. Getting outside's great. So yeah, looking forward to a good spring and summer and fall.
Yeah. So what are we talking about today, Dan?
Well, we're getting into something that everybody kind of dreams about, which is, or not everyone, but a lot of people, and about early retirement, right? So everybody's like, boy, if I do everything right, I think I can get out early, which would be fantastic. And so really we're talking today is it all fantastic? A lot of times it can be, but sometimes maybe it's not what it's all cracked up to be. And so understanding a little bit about, what early retirement might mean, some of the financial implications, obviously, some of the pros and cons from an emotional standpoint, because obviously, like anytime you make a change, this is the kind of life's general rule, right?
Yep.
There's unexpected consequences, right? So we want to talk about that and really educate not only about those things, but then also from a financial planning standpoint, what are the things you really need to do, if that's on the plate for you, like with early retirement, and really making sure that if you make that choice financially, you're going to be okay, because, we'll talk about some of the problems with retiring early and longevity and those types of things.
Yeah, I full confession here going into this. I have never dreamed of early retirement. I can't imagine. I really honestly can't imagine retiring, to be honest with you.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of people that feel like you do. They love what they do. They're like, I don't know, I can't imagine stopping, right? But there are a lot of people in today's world, the hustle and bustle, and especially depending on, like, maybe you have a job where it's a really tough commute. And, it really, you get there, it's stressful. And you might be like, okay, this has been good for my, prosperity, but maybe it's time to make a change, right? And so everybody has their different things. But one of the things that we kind of think about is when you're talking about early retirement, are you retiring to something, or are you kind of just trying to get away from something, right?
Good point.
Because, that's the stuff we want to talk about is, what that looks like. Because it's a big change. It's a monumental change, really.
Yeah. Now, as a guy who, for many, many years, for like 3 decades, I had an hour and a half commute each way on a good day to get to a job that I spent, 10 hours or more at every day. So I can understand the kind of appeal to make a change. I can understand what that appeal might be in terms of, wanting to retire early, but there are a lot of moving pieces that have to fit and go just right. And I would imagine, particularly from your viewpoint, that a lot of things have to be planned for.
Yeah. And I mean, to be honest, you look at like why it appeals to so many people. Like, you kind of mentioned some things that can get old really quickly. You're running hard, a 3-hour commute. Now, there are some differences. So like if you live in an area and you have a commute, but maybe you're able to take a train where you can actually do some things and you're not driving a car, right? That can be different. Like you could actually have some somewhat quality time for those 3 hours between the morning and evening. But if you're driving, right, that kind of limits that to a great degree. And if you're driving, can create a lot more stress, right? So there's things like that to consider. But, a lot of people look at it and they kind of dream of, when you're thinking of a change that you can somewhat control, a lot of times it's kind of utopic, right? You're like, this is going to be amazing, right? No more getting up and going to work, no more doing this and that. But the reality is a lot of people, that's one of the drivers, is that freedom and flexibility, right? Really having control over their time and being able to dictate what they do in those hours. And we're going to talk a little later about the 168 hours in a week, and how you fill those and things. So we'll get into that a little bit. But the other thing, people think of health and lifestyle benefits, right? So like health wise, you see a lot of people that are working a lot of hours and they really have put off like exercise because, the hours get squeezed and they don't have as much time as they would like to do that, which can definitely cause a lot of issues if you're not able to exercise at all. But as far as like lifestyle benefits, you think of like maybe there's travel involved. There could be hobbies that you love. There could be other things that give you purpose that you want to spend time on. And you just haven't had the time, right? Like literally there's just between work and everything else.
Totally. Yes. Absolutely.
And then one of the other big drivers, like we talked about, is kind of escaping that burnout, high stress work environment. And there are some of those that exist today, right? Where it's like, oh my gosh, like as soon as I walk in the office, it's crazy, right? And, there's some jobs that because of that, people are like, going back to health, I need to make a change because this is wearing on me. And, I don't want to be dying at my desk, basically, with a heart attack or something because of the stress involved.
Yes.
And so, there's a lot of those are kind of the primary things that kind of push people, to like think about retiring early. But there's a lot of factors to consider. So
I get the burnout and I get the high stress. And I had friends of mine who would talk about going to lunch and I'd look at them and I'm like, couldn't even relate. Like every lunch I ever had was at my desk and it was usually about 15 minutes long if I was lucky. So I get that. But it's just not something I can imagine. And I don't associate a lot of good stories with retiring early. And maybe you can correct me there.
Yeah, we've had some clients. Actually, we've had both sides of that. So I'll share a couple of those. We had one client there, one of the spouses had suffered kind of a health scare. And they had run hard. They had been really great savers. They'd always done everything right. Debt was paid off. They were in a great financial position. And when they went through that, they kind of looked in the mirror and said, wait a minute, there's not that many years left in our lives. We're getting close to 60 and not that that's old, but you start thinking more about it. And they pulled the trigger. We went through all the steps, make sure they were in good shape to do that. But they've had a wonderful retirement. They filled it with travel. They golf, which is a big thing, and of course pickleball is becoming big, and so they've kind of had this balance between spending time with kids and grandkids, doing activities like, some sports type activities, involved with their faith, right? Like doing the travel, all these different things. And so they've had a wonderful retirement because number one, a lot of that was around, they weren't really running from a job per se. They were kind of like, hey, the reality is like, we're in good shape. We can do this. And we have a lot of things that we want to fill the hours with. Right. So that was a good example.
That's great.
We had another example where somebody kind of ran from a job and it was a guy that had retired and they were fine financially. That was not the issue. But he came in a few months later, it was about 6 months later. We're just doing a regular review. And he was really struggling. I mean, he had really lost his purpose, in that regular schedule, that knowing what he was going to do in the morning when he woke up. And luckily, he's gotten through that because he found some part-time work and some other things to kind of, replace that.
Yep.
But it was a reality. He was really feeling low. And so like that's one of the reasons I want to talk about this topic is to get into some of these things that you need to think about. Because it can be great, but you really have to have it planned out, or it can maybe not be so great if you got a lot out of your job and a lot of fulfillment, and all of a sudden you decided, hey, I'm this age, so I should retire because I can, right? Like, you know what I mean?
No, I do. I know totally what you mean. But I'm sitting here thinking, but Dan, there are a lot of risk. There's a lot of risk to life, period. Okay. Let's get that out of the way. But when you retire early, it seems to me that there are certain risks that you need to recognize and maybe you can plan for.
There's absolutely risks. And I mean, that's the one thing that, sometimes when you're considering something that you're excited about, that could be buying a new car, right? That could be buying a new house. There could be a lot of things. Retirement. We tend to, as human beings, for the most part, really focus on what excites us. And sometimes we don't spend enough time thinking about the negatives, right? Mm-hmm. Or what could derail that plan, right? I remember years ago, it was a book I read and it was talking about like managing projects. And it said, okay, the idea, you might have heard this, Bill, like of doing a pre-mortem analysis where you said, okay, let's assume the project fails. Why did it fail? So what it did is it took you out of that excitement and it said, okay, we're going to assume this failed. So what are all the things that might have caused it to fail, right? Which is interesting because it shifts your thinking, right?
Yeah.
So like in this case, some of the things that you always have to think about, number one is longevity risk. So let's say you're at 57, 58 years old and you're going to retire. Well, there's a very high probability if you're in decent health that you're going to live till 90, 95, maybe 100, right? You see more people reaching 100 every day, and that continues to grow. And so, okay, that's a lot of years. And so you start looking at it, you're like, okay, that's a lot of years to be retired. Are we really okay financially? If we live that long. So that's a really big one. Another one's the healthcare gap. And people are becoming more aware of this because the days of retiree healthcare for most companies is kind of gone. That used to be very popular and very common. But now, generally speaking, when you retire, you might be able to get COBRA for a year and a half, or maybe a little longer, depending on your company plan. And then typically you're having to buy insurance on the healthcare exchange up until 65 when Medicare would begin, right?
Yes.
That can be a real issue because, there can be substantial differences in coverage between what you experienced at your company, as far as like co-pays, out-of-pocket expenses. And your premiums can be substantially different, right? So you start looking at how much you might be paying for healthcare, and that's a huge thing that you have to factor in because a lot of people don't put as much thought into that as they should. They're thinking like, here's our regular expenses, but they can forget about that very easily. So that's a big one. Another one is like what we call sequence of returns risk, which is something a lot of people are like, what the heck are you talking about? Well, sequence of returns is kind of, how markets tend to work. So you asked, like if you look at research, what's the S&P 500 returned over its history? And you'll typically find a number around 10%, right?
Right.
So people kind of think, oh, markets return 10%. I can take out 8% of that portfolio every year. I'm fine, right? No problem. What they don't really realize is that it doesn't really get a 10% return most years, right?
It doesn't really work that way.
It might get 30, it might get minus 10, it might get minus 20. It could be all over the board. And that's really what's called sequence of returns, is those differing returns each year. So that can really affect your retirement because if you don't have a solid plan in place and you don't have the right structure for creating that income, and you start having to cash in stock positions when markets are down, the game can change very quickly as far as like whether you're really in a good financial position or not. So that's a really, really big one. Social Security, understanding if you work less, your Social Security benefit might not be what you expected. And if you end up having to take it earlier, you could take a pretty substantial reduction.
Yeah. And I was going to interrupt you there, Dan, because it's like I talk to people from time to time who talk about, well, I'm going to take Social Security early. And I'm like, meaning before their full retirement age.
Right.
And I'm like, do you really want to do that? It's, do you understand the consequences of you doing that and how much it's going to hurt what you get over time, let alone like this month?
Yeah.
And, and I'm like, you should probably talk to your planner about this one. Cause I don't think, Dan, a lot of people understand there are some serious consequences to deciding I'm not going to wait till whatever your full retirement age. I'm not going to wait till I'm 67. I'm going to take it at 61 because, well, I'm done.
Yeah, that's a huge topic. And we talk a lot with clients about that because there's a lot of misunderstandings around Social Security.
Mm-hmm.
One of them is this idea, well, when I retire, I need to start that. Like you have no choice. You have a choice as to when you start it. Even if you're retired, you can push that off. Ultimately, the last age is really 70 to get the very most you're going to get out of Social Security. But the thing that people miss so often is there's something called cost of living adjustment, or COLA, on Social Security, and that's a percentage increase annually. So if you think about one of the things that happens is if you wait with your Social Security and you start with a larger dollar benefit amount each month, when those raises come in, which, average about 2.5%, but they can be bigger, like depending on the year, or they can be smaller. But if you have a percentage raise on a bigger number, your monthly increase is bigger from a dollar perspective, right? And so all of a sudden your raises are bigger each year. And so that over time has a massive, massive impact, right, on your total benefits received. And so you get this widening gap between monthly benefits when you take it early versus waiting. And, as you, again, back to longevity, if you're living a really long time, that gap can get really big. And so you got to be aware of that. Doesn't mean that there aren't certain situations where someone should take it earlier. It really depends on family history. It depends on whether you're married or single. It depends on all your other resources, right? To get make a really educated decision on that. So but good point. You really have to understand that. And really the one thing, a couple other little things on financial realities you can't ignore are taxes and withdrawal strategies. We've talked before about taxes on the show and understanding. Brent in our office actually just ran an analysis on a couple that are going to retire in, I think, 2 years. They, with proper tax planning, they have the opportunity, based on projections and based on software we use, to reduce taxes, I think, pushing $1 million over their lifetime with proper planning. So what's that mean on the flip side, Bill? If you don't have proper planning, you're doing what? You're paying an extra.
You're giving the government more money than you need to be giving the government. Yes.
Yeah. So there's a lot of science behind tax planning in retirement as well as withdrawal strategies. Got to understand that. And the last big thing is inflation. It's a reality. We experience more inflation recently. But the thing that's tough about inflation, we had that high inflation after COVID. That doesn't go away. You know what I mean? It's not like, it's just prices are just high for that period, then they'll come back down. Generally speaking, with inflation, once prices rise, most times the pace of increases may go down, right? Which, like, our annual inflation has gone down, but we haven't had deflation, meaning like prices have gone back where they were before COVID or close to it. And so you got to plan for that, because it's something that you don't have control over it, but if you just ignore it, you're going to be in a bad spot.
No, man, you make such a good point. And I will tell you, when I used to work with young financial writers all of the time, there's an assumption out there that it's like, well, when prices aren't going up, they're going down. And I used to say, no, the rate at which they're increasing has slowed, or the rate at which they increase has sped up. Everything's not like a gallon of gas. You're used to seeing a gallon of gas maybe go up in the summertime, and then you see it come back down again.
Right.
That's an actual price decrease. But that's not the way the overall economy works.
100%. That's a great point. It's the pace at which they change. If you look historically, the only time we really had substantial deflation was after the Great Depression, right? That was about the only time. But typically, you look at our history, inflation numbers have been higher and lower, but overall, it's always rising to some degree, right? So that's totally a big thing for sure.
That's the risk. What about the pros?
Yeah, there's some. Actually, we're going to go through a few pros and cons. I think these are great. Number one, you got more time to do what you want to do. You got more time for family. You got more time for your health and experiences that maybe you have missed out on because you have worked a lot. That's awesome, right? Having true control over what you do day to day. A lot of times, and we've had a lot of clients do this, they pursue part-time jobs, or things like, what I love. Got a lot of guys that are big, tinkerers. They're doing a lot of stuff around the house. They might find joy in working at a local Ace Hardware, where number one, they can provide, some assistance to people on projects, which gives them fulfillment, but then also maybe they get a discount and stuff there for home, right? And make a few bucks, right? So that, you find people that can do some of those things. And really the potential for better mental health, and unfortunately in the U.S., we joke a lot about mental health, which it's a real thing. And, it's something that we don't probably put enough time into personally. There's been a stigma. I think it's getting better, but people talking to counselors or therapists and like, oh, what's wrong with you? Those types of things. The reality is a lot of people need that. And it's a good thing that we have all those people out there that can service them, right? And talk through things, because sometimes when we're running really hard, some of those things are masked, right? Now we've got extra time. You can focus more on that and having balance in your life and kind of looking at day to day, how do I spend my time? And am I really getting, my share of exercise and family time and sports and, you know what I mean, and relationships. So that's a huge benefit with having more time for that. And, the cons, honestly, the negatives, number one, complex financial planning. The longer time that you have to live on your nest egg, the more you have to pay attention to really good planning to make sure that you don't run out, right? And you don't have an issue that you don't expect. You have fewer years to save. So really, you've got more years to spend, fewer years to save. Like, I'm always shocked, and I've been doing this a long time, obviously, but when you run projections and somebody works one more year, how much of an impact that can have on their overall plan. Just 1 year a lot of times. And so understanding the impact of retiring early. And really that other con is that emotional transition. And people have a hard time, and men and women, actually, I've done some research on this, have different challenges with early retirement, but both have issues with maybe losing their identity a little bit. Hey, I had this job. I was, the go-to guy or girl at my work. I had a lot of responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
It brought me a lot of fulfillment, social interactions, all that stuff, can go away. And that can be really tough. And one of the things, too, we've run into, which is something I just thought about, when people are able to retire early, a lot of times their friends are not. And so people you hang out with, you're thinking, oh, I'm going to have all this time. I can hang out with Joe. And well, Joe's at work, and Joe can't go play golf in the middle of the day.
Oh, that's a great point. That's a great point.
So you got to kind of remember that, hey, the people you interact with regularly after work or on weekends may still be working. And so they can't just go do things with you that maybe you were thinking they would. Right? So big deal.
That's a huge deal, actually. That is really, really interesting. So I want to retire early. Let's just recap and go over. I'm convinced. I'm ready to go, Dan. What do we need to do just to be prudent about this?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing is you need, we're talking about, you need a written financial plan. You need to know ahead of time, how am I going to create this income? How am I going to pay for my health care? How am I going to manage my taxes, which is a huge, huge issue, in order to make this work and live the life that I want to live, right? That's the number one thing. Part of that planning is what we call worst case scenario planning, right? So people think, oh, everything's going to be great. Well, let's look at if some things change. Let's look at Social Security gets cut, so your benefit's not as high. Let's look at markets perform lower than they have historically, right? Let's look at health costs increase, right? What if that happens? Do we have enough buffer in there to take care of that? And one of the things that people neglect all the time, what if one of the spouses dies early? Because that's a huge thing. You lose Social Security, your tax brackets change, and you have to, they think, oh, we're retiring early. That's not a concern. Well, it can be. And we all know that. There's no guarantees in life. And so you got to look at those things. And then some of the other things for if you want to make this work is consider what we call bridging strategies, which is kind of that part-time work, maybe a phased-in retirement, maybe you've got rental income, you've got something where you could, maybe have a rental property and you've got time to work on it and manage that now. But figuring out a way to bridge it so you've got kind of a transition versus just I'm done, where you kind of, that can cause a lot of challenges, right?
Yes.
That's a big thing. And then going with that tax planning, tax efficient withdrawal strategies. So we talked about Social Security. That's Brent in the office likes to say, and I like this analogy, you got all these things on the shelf. Picture yourself at the grocery store. You got all these different items on the shelf. You've got your Social Security. You might have a pension. You've got retirement accounts, maybe Roth IRA accounts. You might have a brokerage account, all these different things. And now what we need to do is figure out how do we use those things to create our income, which is called a withdrawal strategy, right? Well, there's good ways and there's bad ways. In using how to pick out how to use those things can be a major difference in success, which is part of your plan. And that's why it's so important. I will mention really quickly on that, one of the issues that we've seen are people that have done very well with saving and they're in great shape. They get a little overconfident and oh, I don't even need an advisor. I can do this.
Yeah.
Says they're fine. what they don't realize are all these issues. And if they don't manage them correctly, they may still be okay, but the probability can go down substantially, right? Without that. And the very last thing I'll mention for really a successful experience, have a game plan. And what I mean by that, there's some people that have done this, and I think it's great. They'll actually create a retirement calendar. And so that retirement calendar is kind of like a weekly, oh, you know what? Here's my golf league. Here's my, I go to church here. I'm going to go do some volunteering here. I'm going to visit the kids here. A lot of people retiring, especially if you retire early, may have like to care for parents, or that might be part of their routine, right? Where they've got to do some of those things. Throw it on a calendar, because there's a lot of power mentally in knowing, hey, tomorrow I've got this, Wednesday I've got that. And we know a lot of people that have done that, and it gives them a much improved quality of life in retirement.
I know a lot of people who like the idea of retirement is if I don't wake up in the morning and I don't have a purpose and I don't have something to do, what am I going to do? Just sit around and read, just sit around the house and stare at the walls? Purpose. You said something at the beginning of this podcast. Are you retiring from something, or are you retiring to something? And purpose makes all of the difference in terms of that equation.
Oh, there's no doubt. I mean, we've seen people that, and what's funny is that it's really not about money. We obviously have people at all different levels of wealth.
Sure.
And the connection we see with happiness and retirement, there's very little connection between the amount of wealth, and it's actually so much more what you just said. Like, they are genuinely happy because they feel fulfilled on a daily basis, and that's generally because they've got things that they have a purpose around, and they're active. They're out doing stuff, and I can't emphasize that enough. Like, so that idea of having, you laugh about, oh, that's goofy, a retirement calendar. Is it? Because I could tell you there's a lot of things when you look at your day and you're like, hey, most people are busy, but you ever have those weekends there's nothing going on, and then you're like, this is a little weird. Like, I have nothing.
I have nothing.
And that's just a weekend.
Right.
So sometimes it's great because you're like, I need that weekend. But, you'd like to see maybe dinner with friends on Friday or Saturday or something, where you're out like actually seeing someone and doing something.
No, totally agree. And before we wrap this all up, I mean, I think one of the most important things that you've mentioned here, and it's worth reiterating again, is if you don't have an advisor, go to one, find one.
Yeah.
Because you, for example, are an asset. You're an asset to those people. You're not a subtraction, you're an asset. And so, Dan, if anybody's listening to this podcast who are thinking, I don't have an advisor, or this guy sounds interesting, I'd like to have a conversation with him, how can they get a hold of you? How can they reach out and get in touch?
Yeah, you can always call our office at 517-783-1695. Highly encourage everyone to go out to Avery Wealth's website, which is just what it says, Avery Wealth, Avery Wealth.com. Tons of great information out there. A lot of learning. Like, if you go to our insights, we have all kinds of great downloadable content, reports you can review, learning about different things. And I do encourage people to kind of take that on and learn. But you said about the advisor, one thing that, the goal is obviously to hire an advisor that is an asset. And so finding a true fiduciary, and you see that term thrown around a lot. But when I talk about a true fiduciary, somebody that really is giving you the best advice. Simple example, we're talking about the different resources on the shelf to create your retirement income plan. Mm-hmm. Like, one of the things you'll note is a lot of advisors get paid on assets under management, like how much, they manage, right, is how they get paid. So the more money they manage, the more money they make. Mm-hmm. And so what you think about, there can be a conflict of interest when they say when to take your Social Security. Because if they tell you to take it earlier, that means there's less money coming out of retirement accounts at that point versus later. So, like, one of the things we talk about fiduciaries, make sure as you're talking to them that they are truly giving you advice that's in your best interest, that they are walking through. Because like I said, that example for Social Security, everybody's different. They should be able to show you with all the software that's out there today where your optimal age is, right, to take that and where it's going to put you in the best long-term position. So make sure as you're picking advisors that they're doing those types of things, because if they're not truly working in your best interest, they actually could do more harm. And that's the last thing anybody wants. We want you to have a great retirement. And so just always keep that in mind as you're introducing you're meeting an advisor, you're looking at different options.
That is a great point. And the other one I just want to remind listeners who are listening to this podcast is, if you haven't met Dan before, having an initial meeting with Dan does not mean that the two of you are going to go get married here. It's it literally any conversation you might have with any financial advisor, that initial one is just to Dan's point. Is this a fit? Does this work? Do we work? Do we fit together? So to that end, I really would encourage you, if you don't have an advisor, to reach out to Dan. The other thing I would encourage you to do is hit and subscribe to this podcast so that every time a new episode is released, you'll be notified and you can give it a listen. Pretty simple. Also, please, if you like the podcast, like it and share it with folks. Word of mouth promotion is a very welcome tool, and we would very much appreciate it. So until next time, I'm Bill Tucker, along with Dan and everybody at Avery Wealth. Thank you for taking the time to listen today, and we'll catch you next time. Thank you for listening to Ramp Up Your Retirement. Click the follow button to be notified when new episodes become available. Visit our website at www.averywealth.com or give us a call at 517-783-1695. And don't forget to click the follow button to be notified when new episodes become available. The information covered and posted represents the views and opinions of the guest and does not necessarily represent the views or opinions of Avery Wealth. The content has been made available for informational and educational purposes only. The content is not intended to be a substitute for professional investing advice. Always seek the advice of your financial advisor or other qualified financial service provider with any questions you may have regarding your investment planning. The opinions voiced in Ramp Up to Retirement with Dan Reese are for general information only and are not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations for any individual. To determine what may be appropriate for you, consult with your attorney, accountant, financial or tax advisor prior to investing. Guests on the show may not be affiliated with CWM LLC. Views and comments by guests may not be representative of CWM LLC. Investment advisory services are offered through CWM LLC, an SEC-registered investment advisor. Carson Partners, a division of CWM LLC, is a nationwide partnership of advisors.